through my experience, you come across families that have got disengagement in education, at least 2 generations, and so that ability to really transform the lives of those young people, you have to kind of get through to the family.
Hello and welcome to the Leading With podcast, the podcast made for school leaders by school leaders. I'm John Cripwell, National Education Lead for Primary Maths here at Twinkl, and today I'm delighted to be joined by our Chief Education Officer, Stuart Parker-Tyreman. Welcome, Stuart.
Thanks, John.
So Stuart, you've been with Twinkl for a couple of months now. We were just reminiscing, it feels like a little bit longer in some ways. Is it okay just to give a very quick sort of potted history about what's brought you to this role?
Yeah, no problem at all. So I've had quite a long career in education. I started out as a PE teacher many moons ago. Certainly wish I could go back to those days of fitness and level and on that side of things. But qualified from Southampton University. I went straight into working in a cross-city pupil referral unit. Back in those days, you couldn't qualify to be a teacher, right, when you were working in those sorts of settings. So I applied for the graduate teacher program and ended up being a practitioner in a secondary school, and was given an opportunity to deliver the PE, which was fantastic, because before that I was working across the city, both in the hospital schools, as well as working with Southampton Football Club, which was quite cool. But I had a massive interest in terms of rugby and football back in those days. So having the opportunity to go into the education sector and qualify as a teacher while being a practitioner was pretty cool. But very quickly, I was able to understand what it took to kind of work across departments and shall we say, get really into knowing the young people, and establishing those relationships. PE taught me that quite quickly. And it does link to answer the question. But very early on in my career, I had to pivot and I started teaching science alongside that. I've got a sports science degree. But interesting enough, teaching science through the medium of PE, you suddenly start to engage lots of kind of different characters, shall we say, in the learning, and you find different ways of doing things. And I think that's where ultimately, shall we say, my kind of talent lay. And then on that journey, I became a head teacher quite early, working in a special education school that back in that day was called EBD, so emotional behavioural difficulties. Then it became BESD, which behaviour, emotional, social difficulties, and then eventually social, emotional, mental health needs. In terms of, again, why am I sharing that? Well, it just shows you how quickly the system changes and evolves all the rest of it. And how have I ended up at Twinkl? Well, on that journey from being a head teacher in my early 30s, the barriers that you face to try and engage young people are immense. And part of my journey involved establishing a multi-academic trust, because I believe in the education continuum. And how do you kind of share that professional capital across the system from early years to primary into secondary and then on to post-16. And we did that in a community, which was really exciting. But you do realise that even with that scalability, it's not enough scalability to really overcome the system challenges. So I've got this this theory that I'm now playing out in real time with Twinkl, having been an executive head teacher and a director of children and family services, that actually to work in the commercial sector with an ethically driven organisation such as Twinkl that wants to help those that teach, to really bring some of that capacity back to the system. And that's the mission. And that's why I'm here. And that's why I took the role, which I'm really excited about.
And we're very lucky to have you. So this morning we're going to have a conversation about closing the attainment gap. Clearly something that, as you say, has driven you throughout your career. So if we start with your experience of leading across a MAT and being fundamental in setting up a MAT, as you say, what separates the pupil premium strategies that genuinely shift outcomes from just those that kind of look good on paper?
I'm kind of reflecting on that question and thinking, blimey, if I knew now what I if I knew then what I know now, that could be quite an interesting one to go forward. So being reflective on that, what looks good on paper, I think it's recognizing that you just can't do things that look good on paper. If you're driven by what looks good on paper, you're kind of not in the game from the outset, right? And so actually for me, it's very much a division in that question around what is the long-term sustainable strategies versus what are the kind of the short-term gains that might look, like you say, pretty on paper. For me, it was always about the long-term gains. I think when you look at the deficit for some young people. It's generational from an education perspective. Very frequently through my experience, you come across families that have got disengagement in education, at least 2 generations, and so that ability to really transform the lives of those young people, you have to kind of get through to the family.
It's very difficult to do that in a 2-3 term cycle, isn't it? You're not going to turn that around in a year. So
Absolutely. But the game I say the game you play, I mean, I'm very careful with the language that I'm using, but you do have to kind of recognize what the system's looking at you and what lens it's looking at through. And the reality of the education system is it looks through very short-term cycles. I can reference Ofsted, I could reference local authorities, can reference regional school commissioners. They're going to look at a lens through what it might be at max a 4-year cycle, possibly 5-year at secondary. But the reality is these problems are ingrained. So going back to kind of playing the game, what you have to do with those short-term ones is show that the figures are moving in the right direction. You have to be able to articulate, hence why you report annually, obviously, on premium spend to demonstrate impact. But the clever bit, and I'm pretty confident this is what school leaders and MAT leaders do across the board, because I've got absolute confidence in the system in terms of being driven by the right practitioners, is that they're doing that whilst underneath everything driving the big game changers, which is the community driving, which isn't a 4-year cycle, it's not a 2-year cycle, it's a 10-year cycle. And I think that for me is what really is transformative to the system. And so you're seeing more and more literature come out from a pupil premium perspective about how we are engaging with community through that, how you're removing those long-term barriers because you're creating a sense of belonging across the system. And that isn't about necessarily just doing a short-term intervention. That's a long-term intervention that starts at early years and carries on all the way through. So again, how do you pull that funding in a way when, again, there are barriers placed in terms of the ring fencing that goes on with the premium spend?
Yeah. And you mentioned belonging there, actually. It's probably a subject that we could touch on, if that's okay. You've mentioned before, I think, that there's a connection in your mind between belonging, attendance, which we know is a hot topic at the moment, and behaviour as well, which is also something that we talk about quite a lot in education. If belonging is important in that sort of context of attendance and behaviour, what are the key drivers, do you think, that school leaders can impact on that would lead to a better sense of belonging in a community, a school community?
Yeah, I think I absolutely concur with the belonging sentiment, as I mentioned before. I think, again, in order to belong, you need to be part of something. We need to be part of a network in some description. I think the school system itself can be incredibly fragmented on lots of levels. I think for those young people that are most vulnerable, it's probably even more fragmented. And so if I take a position and view of it from a special school, for example, which again was kind of where I cut my teeth in headship when I started out, my thinking behind that was that actually by definition, and this is a little bit controversial, how is a special school an inclusive environment? You have to get a special certificate, an EHCP, to actually and back in the day when I was doing that statement, to actually get into the special school. And then you're in this special school bubble almost.
Yeah.
So there you can culture and cultivate, a sense of belonging within the school and within the family groups, but actually the wider system, which is ultimately the big bad world, shall we say, that every 16-year-old and 18-year-old then transitions back into, it's not as protective, even with an EHCP to 25. So going back to the reference around belonging, what I tried to achieve there was saying right from the outset, well, you can't be seen in isolation as just going to a special school. You've got to be part of your peer group, because you might come to a special school on a day-to-day basis, but you go back to the community that you're coming from. Just because you get in a taxi in the morning and get escorted to school, your mates in your area are still going to their local school.
Yeah.
So why would you not create the connection between the two schools, the special school and the mainstream secondary, for example, or the primary? But by enabling that partnership and that collective as a group of schools, you're both enabling the young person to feel a sense of belonging because they're not disconnected from their community.
Yeah.
I.e. they're being transported. Because so often, again, you go on a complete tangent, I'll slightly go on a tangent, special schools very rarely operate within the communities they serve. So you actually got young people that get into taxis traveling miles and miles and miles into a community that they don't know. So you've got to kind of take take the special school almost to them, which is why then you've got to work closer with your school so you can have an earlier intervention type model, which then starts to kind of not create not just a belonging for the young people and the family, but a belonging for the staff and the culture of the schools, because the schools themselves are crying out for help and support around some of these most hard to reach vulnerable learners.
And you've mentioned, yeah, no, it does. And you mentioned earlier in a previous response that the role of parents and how important it is to engage parents in their children's education. And some parents, from their own experiences, have got hang-ups and barriers to engaging with schools. How do you think schools can act to really engage parents and give them a sense of belonging as well in that environment that might feel alien to them?
Yeah, I think schools have got a pivotal role to play in their communities, and sometimes I think on the day-to-day job, and again within the, how should we say, the system pressures that exist, trying to find the capacity within the school's development and improvement plan, for example, to really invest in the local communities is a real tough call. And then for me, that's again, how do you kind of inject capacity in the system? And that kind of does link to the different kind of funding routes that come in. You've got to create gravitas for those families. Kind of back in my day, on my background is I'm actually from, my dad was in the Navy, one of the lower ranks. And I grew up in an area which actually served the services incredibly well. They used to have things like sailors' rests, they used to call them, which were like little kind of entities that sat on the corner of the school, where actually these families could come together at the end of the school day. And what that would give is, all the parents who might have a partner at sea, for example, they would have somewhere to congregate and come together and talk about the challenges. Because again, from my own experience and my mum's kind of communication to me on her journey, to a certain, it was 6 months of the year at times with my dad, and when he'd be away and she was trying to raise 3 kids, that's incredibly challenging, whatever way you kind of look at that. But having a sense of community or a location for her to go to where she could see other mums, other parents that were having those same challenges, it's amazing. And I've seen it all the way through my career, just how supportive people are to each other, that kind of human spirit bit. But you've got to create an environment that creates the gravitas to bring, should we say, the human beings together in the first place. And schools are in a really pivotal place to be able to do that.
So looking for opportunities to be outward facing and welcoming, but also, as you say, building the reason for people to come and to be involved in the school. So I think it's clear that there's growing pressure, increasing pressure on schools to support growing numbers of pupils with SEND, EAL, lack pupils, pupil premium learners. But we know that there are finite and very limited resources in the system. In your opinion, what strategic principles would help schools to stay focused on their core mission and avoid firefighting all the time?
Yeah, definitely an at the beginning of that one for me. Another the challenge is huge, the way you've articulated it. I think the better and more sophisticated we come around understanding neurology and the art of learning, the craft of learning, the craft of teaching, inevitably we start to pick up all these different kind of groups and subcategories of types of learners and so on and so forth. I think it's inevitable, that actually we start to understand different niches and actually how we enable young people to learn in particular ways, because they might have particular needs and focus. I mean, ultimately the mission is, how do you kind of enable them to all be contributors to society and community beyond schools, right? So we've got to recognize the difference in the diversity, but at the same time nurture it in a way that actually it all kind of comes together as in one. You get the blend right, so to speak, for the community. So absolutely the strategic aims have to be the long-term objective. I don't want to be absolute about not doing the small stuff. You got to a certain degree, you got to sweat the small stuff to get the strategies to work, right? So I appreciate the term around the kind of firefighting, but actually there's an art to firefighting. And I've drawn some experience in my past that working in an EBD setting, an SEMH setting, that notion that when you see an adult engaging with a young person, and part of the positive behaviour management training you have is the question that was asked by Janine Law, who trained me that back then. And she said, what do you fight fire with, And so often what you see people do is try and fight fire with fire rather than actually thinking, it's water, right? What is the opposite? So I don't want to ignore the fact that actually that firefighting with water is still a good thing, right? It's still a very, very good thing. From a strategic perspective, though, those long-term kind of objectives and priorities, it's recognizing how you kind of share the workload. I'm very much of the view and of the learnt view over my career, which you can't overcome these barriers on your own as a school and an organisation. You can only go so far. So those networks are absolutely crucial. And the notion that I'll reference is health creation networks. How do you make an organisation greater than the sum of its parts? Well, what you've got to do is you draw on the other community, should we say, ambassadors and advocates in the system. So how do you work alongside care? How do you work alongside health? Because I think there is an absolute ripeness for it now, because the same barriers education faces with addressing the multiple complex needs of its stakeholder group, primary care health, trusts are doing the same.
Yeah.
The care systems are doing the same. It's overwhelmed. Local authorities are trying to do the same. The school down the road's trying to do the same, right? So what you've got to do is create an advocacy and a should we say, almost a charter at the center of how are we all going to work together, and what responsibility are we going to take for the different segments within this, and then how do we act as a collective force to kind of hopefully support the community we serve. And the notion that I came across in London, but it was a Bromley by Bow Centre where I first experienced this notion of health creation networks, and just seeing some of the kind of the social subscribing model was fascinating. But actually, almost how might you have a social subscribing model for schools and families in terms of the networks that they engage with? Where are you seeing the particular need, and then who do you draw upon, and how do you refer to those organizations? And at the heart of it is just bringing human beings together to support each other. And so I think if we can focus on that, kind of creating that collective sense of belonging, I've already said that already, but sense of community again at the heart, I think we can find long-term sustainable strategies that will work for the bespoke communities they serve.
Yeah, and there's definitely something in that, isn't there? In so much as schools are never going to be a place where everything just runs smoothly and there's never any need for firefighting. That's why we have these in-tray exercises, isn't it? When you go for leadership roles. A friend of mine messaged me the other morning about her morning in school, and it felt like one of those in-tray exercises.
Yeah.
But that's what schools do so well. They adapt and they work with,
Incredibly so,
with the capacity that they've got. But as you say, look at the strategic overview, making those connections and building those networks with other organisations, including ourselves, is a way to increase capacity and provide support.
It's a problem halved is a problem solved. Absolutely. And actually, I take a lot from some of those like little anecdotes.
Yeah.
But again, how you work in partnership. I've seen lots of iterations of it over my career, local children's partnerships. But so often what they start and they're not able to be sustained. And again, for me, strategic for schools to understand how do they sustain these things, and inevitably it leads to how do you report on the impact, because of those tighter circles of accountability that exist around particular funding pots. And we've got to be clever. We've got to be really clever about how we respond to what the system's willing to give us, but be transformative with that funding that enables that long-term change. And I actually think at the heart of that is growing that confidence in school leaders, and to a certain degree public sector leaders. I'll go broader, to empower them to make that decision. We're very good at holding to account, and I understand and recognize why it's core that we've got that quality assurance. But if we really trusted us as a professional body, and trust school leaders, trust teachers, actually we put them at front and center as the decision makers in the best way to do this. I think that would be transformative.
It would be remiss of me as the primary maths leader if I didn't pick up on the fact that a problem halved is not always a problem solved, just in some limited circumstances. You've spent a lot of your career, as you've already touched on, really advocating for the most vulnerable learners, potentially. How do you define, and you may have already touched on this, I suppose, but how do you define inclusion done well in a school? And thinking more about possibly mainstream schools, I think you've already mentioned the particular issues around special schools and special settings. with inclusion, but in a mainstream school, what might that look like? Inclusion done really well.
Yeah, I think there's multiple layers to that. I think having a mindset of high expectations from the outset for all learners is absolutely critical. But it's also almost having to be kind of consistently flexible. I know that's a bit of an oxymoron in there, around those young people and those families, to recognize that you've got to modify and you've got to pivot around them. But that elasticity, if I pronounce that properly, for the school leader isn't always something that is apparent. I think it's, again, the system's rigidity kind of counters that, because there's an expectation that we've got to respond in a particular way at school. So what does inclusion look like? It's that ability to be, meeting the needs of the learner, treating them as an individual, but recognizing that they are part of a wider system, and then being as flexible as you possibly can be to enable a way to remove those barriers that those young people face. And that done well is about, I'm going to say, early intervention. That's is what people talk about, but there's a reality that sits behind it. Well, okay, we talk about early intervention. How do you actually do that? I think, again, it's how do you invest in that professional capital within your school?
Mm-hmm.
How do you make sure that practitioners have such a great toolbox at their disposal for working with these young people, that they know what tool might be right for the right job with the right person and the right family at the right time? And we've got to empower our practitioners to be able to do that. And that empowerment comes from making sure that they are given time to learn, to add to their toolbox over time. And I think a core role of that is making sure that professional development is more accessible, and it's trusted professional development. But it's also the networking that needs to be facilitated with those professionals, because those teachers and practitioners on the front line, including the teaching assistants, they are always thirsty for wanting to know different ways of solving the same problem, because they put the young people first. So what does inclusion kind of look like? It's at the forefront of everything you're doing. It's pivoting in a way in that immediate moment when actually a series of actions or behaviors could result in an exclusion, and also in a literal sense of an exclusion. But that toolbox coming to the aid to say, actually, no, we're going to do it this way. We're already going to respond that way. And one of the other things that I'll just finalize on is, what does it look like? I think it's the power to build that resilience in the young people and in the staff, to know that actually, if we sustain that level of intervention for those young people and keep championing them, it's just a period of time and they come out the other side.
Yeah, and so much of what you just said really does.
There's a lot there.
No, but it's important, and it does resonate. As somebody who was working in school until just a few months ago, over my sort of 18 years working in schools, I saw a huge change, I think, in an awareness of the importance of inclusion, firstly, but also in how we access support in schools. And schools are being asked to do more and more and more, aren't they?
Yeah.
And so that idea of upskilling the members of staff that you have at school in order to be able to, I suppose, not take responsibility for all of these things, but to be able to support the pupils that they have, in a more direct way, has got to be a way forward, in your opinion?
No, absolutely. And I think the more we can do in terms of facilitating those networks to be easily accessible, the better. Because one thing I've always had an absolute confidence in is the kind of teaching workforces and the staff within the school, in terms of their eagerness to learn new things. So if you make that new learning accessible, they will seek it out and engage with it, and then they'll look to apply it. And I think, again, that's exciting, because they're trying to find ways to solve problems. That's what teachers and educators are good at. But you've got to kind of, like you say, give them the skill set to do that, and give them the capacity to do that. And for me, so often, from an inclusive approach, starts with that relationship with the young people, or the cohort of young people. And actually, what is a relationship? Well, a relationship is something that you develop because you invest time with another individual to kind of understand them and to know about them. And me and you chatting about either football or rugby, what are your interests, John? What are my interests? You start to form a bond, and as a result, I can be more inclusive by default because I know more about you. And it's that little kind of cultivating that at the center.
One of the things that has come out of these podcasts time and time again is the importance of relationships in schools. Relationships between teachers and pupils, and really understanding people's needs. but also I think between sort of SLT and teachers and being able to understand, teachers' needs and how they can be supported to deliver these things. I've worked with a lot of, I'm going off on a slight tangent here, Stuart, but I've worked with a lot of, I've worked with a lot of small schools, really, some of them quite tiny schools, that really struggle with this capacity problem because there may only be 2 or 3 teachers in the entire school, and a lot of responsibility falls to them. Do you think the opportunities that exist within the MAT structure and actually from an organisation like ourselves has a role to play in supporting those sorts of settings as well?
Absolutely. I've got absolutely. I'll just re-emphasize that word. Capacity is a problem in the system. Scalability is a problem in the system, and I think I articulated at kind of the beginning of our conversation today. One of the drivers for me was creating that scalability across a multi-academy trust, because as an individual special school, you weren't able to overcome those barriers. You couldn't create, should we say, the equity in the system to be able to create change. And if I thought, give you a very direct example, whether you agree with it or you don't agree with it on terms of academy conversion, the ability to even consider converting to an academy was never a goer for one of my schools very early days, because actually we just wouldn't have the kind of back staff to even facilitate the necessary due diligence. Yeah. The only way you do that is you've got to go out there and find a partner that can kind of manage that scalability for you. And actually there's a direct correlation in terms of actually capacity to create a change for schools from convert it into an academy to any systemic change that might relate to, let's for example, to inclusion, because you've got to have the capacity to manage the change and the system change. So your invitation around kind of what responsibility do we have as larger organizations to do that, I think for me that's what was behind the whole idea of the multi-academy trust that we founded, was that through having the scalability that a large secondary school can bring, you can then start to create new scalability for the primary schools and the special schools around them. But what you have to do is fundamentally accept that you're all serving the same community and that you're not in competition with each other.
Yeah.
You're almost like a university campus approach, what we did. What we achieved is the scalability to then invest in new ways of doing things. So educational psychology services, speech and language services, OT, counselling services. These are all things that schools want to aspire to be able to deliver, but their ability to tap into them and the local networks, it's highly costly.
Yeah.
And, there's limited resource, but you can create new resource with new scale. So kind of building towards a little bit and kind of, okay, so why do I find myself here as Chief Education Officer in a commercial entity? Well, for me, it's just another chapter within that journey of trying to solve that problem. MATs do it well, but I believe that actually commercial organizations should have a duty of care to the communities that they serve. And actually organizations of the scale of Twinkl can actually be game changers for schools if we can develop a relationship and a confidence and a trusted, should we say, framework of how we then start to operate with each other. And I think Twinkl does that already by default in terms of the professional development, the authorship that goes on around the resources, the investment in terms of making sure they're qualified staff. So we are able to give almost a quality mark to our customers. We're keen to continue to learn more about from a student voice perspective, from a practitioner's point perspective. And so we want to complement the system. And I think over time that creates a new confidence and a new scale in the system and then back new ways of working, which is what I'm very excited about in terms of what the future can hold over that.
That is exciting. So time is against us, and I appreciate we could talk about this all morning, but just to sort of wrap up really, looking to the future then, you've just touched on this a little bit. What is it that gives you optimism about the system's ability to close attainment gaps, even in this challenging landscape that we find ourselves in?
Yeah. I think schools do an incredible job. And as you would imagine, I'm a massive advocate because the career pathway and that kind of the privilege that I've had to work with so many amazing colleagues. But I fundamentally believe that the schools can't solve it by themselves. And I've learned that more and more at a leadership level. But it was evident when I first walked in my first role back in when I was fresh out of university, working across the PRU, as I said, in terms of the setup in Southampton. And so we've got to find a way of injecting sustainability, because schools have got the right drivers, they're the right advocates for the change, and they are pivotal in terms of contact with so many of these families' lives, because they're at the heart of that community. But something I'm particularly interested in, this notion of health creation networks, about actually, well, how do you draw in capacity from health and care? So kind of how do we work as schools with primary care trusts? And again, those system evolutions that are happening around schools all the time, we have to become greater than the sum of our parts, because that's the only way that you overcome it. In terms of kind of the long-term ambition, I suppose I'll just double back slightly. And a bit controversial, but hopefully what you're hearing is that I don't think schools do have the capacity to do what's necessary. I think they do a nod in the direction, and they dramatically impact on the lives of those young people during that chapter when they're at school. But we talked about generational change. You don't achieve generational change in those kind of decreasing circles of intervention as a school, because you're only in contact with those young people for a short period of time before they become adults, right? So what we have to do is we can take a more long-term view of it, and then enable the system to back what is the role they play during that chapter of that young person or family's life, and then how we kind of bolt things around that for work, vocational training. I mean, we're saying all the right things, but we got to commit to a 10-year plan. We got to commit to a 20-year plan. That's the way that you create substantive change. And I'll kind of finish in terms of a story that's always resonated with me. And it was a cracking head teacher. I'm pretty sure I can cite him in one of these meetings, but his name's Chris Anders. And when I became a head teacher, he mentored me. And so often it's about the people that influence you, isn't it? And he runs a school called Park Community down in Havant. He's still there. And I'll never forget what he said to me. He said that my job here as head teacher is I've got the stewardship for Park Community at the moment. So me acknowledging that actually what he does has to build on what was happening before and whatever comes forward. And then what he said was, I'm building a cathedral. And for me, even now, that resonates so strongly, because actually what does it take to build a cathedral? Huge resource, immense community cohesion, and a commitment over an incredibly long length of time. But look at the structures we built across the kind of UK on that basis, in terms of at the heart of our cities, those cathedrals. They're testament to what you can actually achieve. And I just think that's a really nice way of kind of highlighting what it takes to change the system.
Yeah, it's certainly that long-term view, isn't it? That this is what we want, this is what we aspire to.
Yeah.
The work that it takes to get there isn't
We've got to work out the building blocks,
the
bricks. And I think we've got them, but I think there needs to be more effort put into how do we draw from wider capacity in the system over a longer period of time.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time this morning. I know you're incredibly busy, but I think hopefully that the listeners will have taken a huge amount from what you've shared this morning. And I'm excited to see what we can do to support them next.
Yeah, very excited and happy to update any point going forward.
Thank you very much.
All the best, John. Thank you.